Friends, thank you for being here today. We stand at a moment in our history that years from now will likely be viewed as a definitive turning point, a moment where the tectonic plates of our national strategy shifted beneath our feet, almost imperceptibly to the casual observer, but with earth-shattering consequences for those paying attention. While the 24-hour news cycle remains fixated on the loud, often theatrical pronouncements coming from Washington, threats of tariffs, jokes about the 51st state, and the general volatility of our southern neighbor, something profound has occurred quietly across the Atlantic. On December 1st, 2025, Canada did not just sign a trade deal. We did not simply agree to buy a few ships or sell a few components. We executed what may well be the most brilliant and perhaps the most risky strategic maneuver in modern Western diplomacy. Canada has become the first and currently the only non-European nation admitted to the European Union Security Action for Europe, or SAFE. This is an access pass to a war chest valued at roughly 150 billion euros, or 244 billion Canadian dollars. But to reduce this to a dollar figure is to miss the point entirely. This is about power, it is about dignity, and fundamentally, it is about the complete restructuring of how Canada survives and thrives as a sovereign nation next to a superpower that has ceased to be predictable. For decades, we have operated under a single, comfortable assumption. The United States is our security blanket, our primary market, and our big brother. We have assumed that no matter how rough the rhetoric got, the border would remain open and the security umbrella would remain unfurled. But as we look at the geopolitical landscape today, at a Washington that views trade as warfare and alliances as transactional, that assumption has become a liability. Before we dive deeper, I want to ask you a question that I've been wrestling with myself. Do you believe the United States is still a reliable partner for Canada, or was this pivot inevitable? I'd love to read your initial thoughts in the comments below. By the time we conclude this analysis, you will understand why this quiet announcement changes everything. We are going to walk through the mechanics of this deal, the unprecedented context of the Carney administration, the specific industrial wins for our manufacturing sector, and the very real dangers that lie ahead. This is the story of how Canada stopped waiting for permission and started building a Plan B. To understand why this deal matters, we must first appreciate the precarious position we occupied before the ink was dry. We are living through what historians often call a hinge moment, a point in time where the old rules no longer apply, but the new rules haven't yet been written. For the post-World War II era, the Western Alliance was a wheel with a hub and spokes. The United States was the hub. Canada, Europe, Japan, and Australia were the spokes. The system worked because the hub was strong, reliable, and committed to the integrity of the wheel. But what happens when the hub begins to wobble? What happens when the President of the United States openly questions the value of NATO, threatens to annex neighbors, and weaponizes tariffs against his closest allies? We saw the precursors to this in the early 2020s, but by 2025, the situation had deteriorated from diplomatic friction to economic containment. The second term of the Trump administration brought with it a renewed America First doctrine that viewed Canadian resources not as shared assets of a continental alliance, but as leverage. The imposition of 25% tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and lumber was not just a trade dispute, it was a signal. When those threats escalated to include our automotive sector, the beating heart of Ontario's economy, and when political disagreements over issues like Palestinian statehood led to threats of 35% blanket tariffs, the message was clear. Compliance is the price of access. This was the environment in which Justin Trudeau resigned. The electorate, fatigued by economic stagnation and the Liberal Party's inability to counter American pressure, was ready for a change. But they were not looking for populism, they were looking for competence. Enter Mark Carney. His swift ascendancy to the Prime Minister's office, winning the Liberal leadership with nearly 86% of the vote, signaled a shift in the Canadian psyche. Carney is not a traditional politician in the retail sense. He is a technocrat, a former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. To the Canadian voter, particularly those of us who remember the fiscal discipline required in previous eras, Carney represented a return to serious governance. Carney's thesis was simple but radical. Canada could no longer afford to be a client state of the US. We needed what the Europeans call strategic autonomy. We needed to diversify not just our trade, but our security architecture. We needed to ensure that if the border to the south closed, the lights in Canada would stay on. Simultaneously, Europe was undergoing its own existential awakening. The war in Ukraine had dragged on, exposing the fragility of European defense stockpiles. Russia's aggression was no longer a theoretical threat, but a grinding reality on the continent's edge. The European Union realized it could not rely on an oscillating Washington to guarantee its safety. They established SAFE with a target date of 2030 to have a fully independent operational war production capability. This convergence of Canadian necessity and European urgency created the window of opportunity. Europe needed a secure industrial partner with resources, technical expertise, and political stability. Canada needed a market that valued the rule of law over the rule of force. Now let us strip away the bureaucratic acronyms and look under the hood of this agreement to understand exactly what SAFE represents. Security action for Europe is not merely a pot of money. It is a financial and industrial engine designed to rearm a continent. The European Union has leveraged its collective credit rating AAA status to borrow money on global markets at rock-bottom interest rates. This capital, roughly $244 billion Canadian, is ring-fenced for one purpose: the modernization and expansion of defense production. We are talking about the manufacturing of artillery systems, next-generation missiles, unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, cyber warfare infrastructure, and space-based surveillance assets. This is where the distinction between spending and investing becomes critical. In the past, when NATO nations spoke of defense spending, it often meant buying off-the-shelf equipment from American contractors like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon. SAFE is different. SAFE is about building the capacity to make these things within the Union. It is a jobs program disguised as a security pact. The exclusivity of this club cannot be overstated. When the EU announced SAFE, the line formed quickly. The United Kingdom, realizing the strategic isolation of Brexit, attempted to negotiate entry. They were rebuffed, largely due to lingering mistrust and regulatory misalignment. Australia, a key member of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, lobbied for access but was deemed too geographically and strategically distant. Even the United States, the traditional guarantor of European security, remains outside this framework. Yet Canada was admitted. Why? The answer lies in our temperament. In the eyes of Brussels, Canada is the most European of the non-European nations. We share a commitment to multilateralism, our regulatory frameworks are compatible, and perhaps most importantly, we are viewed as a ballast. In a world where the US is erratic and the UK is detached, Canada offered steady, boring, predictable partnership. We do not weaponize trade. We do not impose surprise export bans. We keep our word. By joining SAFE, Canada effectively steps into a vacuum left by the great powers. We have secured a seat at the table where the future of Western defense technology is being designed. This is not just about selling widgets. It is about being part of the architectural planning of the next 50 years of military technology. Let us scrutinize the specific terms of this agreement because the devil is always in the details. And in this case, the details contain several surprising victories for Canadian interests. The most significant of these, and the one that likely shocked American observers, is the exemption regarding rules of origin. Typically, EU defense projects financed by the Union require that at least 65% of the value of a product be generated within EU member states. This is a protectionist barrier designed to keep European tax dollars within Europe. For an outsider, this is usually a deal breaker. However, reports indicate that Canada secured a specific waiver allowing Canadian firms to contribute up to 80% of a system's value in specific high-demand categories. These categories, drones, sensors, cyber capabilities, and specialized ammunition, are exactly where Canadian industry excels. Companies like CAE, MDA, and our burgeoning drone sector are no longer fighting for scraps. They can bid as prime contractors. This effectively treats a factory in Montreal or Winnipeg as if it were in Munich or Lyon for the purposes of these contracts. Beyond these exemptions, there is the critical advantage of capital access. Canadian defense manufacturers often struggle with the valley of death, the gap between developing a prototype and reaching mass production. Capital in the defense sector is expensive because the risks are high and the contracts are lumpy. Under SAFE, Canadian companies can access the same low-interest, EU-backed financing that European firms enjoy. This removes the financing uncertainty. It allows a Canadian CEO to look at a 15-year horizon and invest in a new plant, knowing the capital costs are manageable and the customer base, 27 nations, is locked in. Of course, critics will inevitably point out that Canada has to pay to play. There is an entry fee to join SAFE, estimated in the range of $10 million initially. However, this fee is structured as a sliding scale based on the success of Canadian bids. We are not writing a blank check to Brussels. We are buying a ticket to a VIP marketplace. If our companies fail to win contracts, our contribution remains minimal. If we win billions in business, our contribution scales up, a cost of doing business that any rational CEO would accept in a heartbeat. Domestically, this deal has also triggered a necessary institutional evolution with the creation of a new Canadian Defence Investment Agency. This is not merely more bureaucracy, it is a necessary interface. Dealing with the European Union requires navigating a labyrinth of regulations. This agency is designed to act as the concierge, harmonizing Canadian standards with European ones and cutting through the red tape. It represents a permanent institutional link, ensuring this partnership survives beyond the current government. We must now address the broader question: why does this matter to the average Canadian? Why should a retired teacher in British Columbia or a small business owner in Nova Scotia care about missile contracts in Europe? The answer is leverage. For the entirety of our lives, the Canadian economy has operated under a monopsony in the defense sector. A monopsony is a market situation where there is only one buyer. When you have only one buyer, the US, that buyer sets the price, the terms, and the political conditions. If Washington decides they don't like our dairy policy, they can threaten to shut down our aerospace supply chain, and we have no recourse because we have nowhere else to sell. This dependency created a ceiling on our sovereignty. We could only be as independent as the United States allowed us to be. The SAFE agreement shatters that ceiling. By integrating into the European supply chain, Canada creates a second option. It is the geopolitical equivalent of a diversified retirement portfolio. If the US threatens tariffs, Canada can now pivot production to the European market. We are no longer cornered. Consider the implications for our own military procurement. For decades, we have been locked into the American military-industrial ecosystem. We bought American jets, like the F-35 controversies of the past, American radios, American missiles. This meant that the source codes, the digital brains of these weapons, remained in American hands. We were renting our security, not owning it. Europe offers a different model: technology transfer. European defense deals, like the potential acquisition of Swedish Gripen fighters or French naval systems, often come with full intellectual property rights and the ability to service and upgrade the equipment in Canada. This builds domestic capacity. It means that when a piece of equipment breaks, we fix it here, rather than shipping it back to a depot in Texas. This deal sends a message to Washington that is polite but firm. Canada is an independent nation with options. We value our friendship with the United States, but we are no longer its captives. As George Conway noted in his analysis, Canada isn't a minor player anymore. They're a strategic actor with options, leverage, and the willingness to use both. I'm curious, do you agree with the idea that Canada gains real leverage here, or do you think this might just poke the bear without giving us enough protection? Let me know your perspective. However, it would be irresponsible to present this agreement as a guaranteed victory without acknowledging the profound risks involved. We are walking a tightrope, and the fall could be severe. The most immediate danger is American retaliation. The United States is not accustomed to its neighbors making major strategic moves without permission. The U.S. defense lobby is one of the most powerful political forces on the planet. When Raytheon and Boeing realize that Canadian companies are taking market share in Europe, market share they believe belongs to them, they will exert pressure on the White House. We could see this manifest as security concerns. The US could argue that if Canada adopts European standards, we are no longer interoperable with NORAD. They could threaten to restrict intelligence sharing or clamp down on the border even harder. The Trump administration has already shown a willingness to invent threats, such as the fictitious drug smuggling claims used to justify tariffs, to punish perceived disloyalty. By joining SAFE, we have painted a target on our backs. Secondly, we must not romanticize the European Union. It is a miracle of diplomacy, but it is also a nightmare of bureaucracy. We are not dealing with one country, we are dealing with 27. Each of those nations, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, has its own domestic defense industry that it wants to protect. There is a very real risk that Canada pays its entry fees, aligns its standards, and then finds itself blocked by soft protectionism. A French general might simply prefer a French drone, regardless of whether the Canadian option is better or cheaper. We are entering a market that has historically been hostile to outsiders, and while the ink on the treaty says we are welcome, the reality on the ground may be different. Finally, we must look in the mirror. Can we actually deliver? The European timeline is aggressive. Full readiness by 2030. Canada's procurement system is notoriously slow, broken, and politicized. We have a history of taking decades to replace pistols and trucks. For Canadian companies to fulfill these contracts, they will need to scale up production at a rate we haven't seen since the Second World War. We need skilled tradespeople, engineers, and factory capacity. If we win the contracts but fail to deliver on time, our reputation as the reliable partner will evaporate, and we will be expelled from the garden as quickly as we were admitted. Let us pause to look at the economic ripple effects. This deal is projected to be part of a broader Rearm Europe initiative that could total over 1 trillion euros in spending over the next decade. For the Canadian economy, this is a lifeline. Our resource sector, oil, gas, timber, has been the traditional engine of our wealth, but it is cyclical and increasingly under environmental pressure. The knowledge economy, tech, AI, specialized manufacturing is where the future growth lies. Defense spending, when done correctly, is a massive driver of innovation. The technology required for a drone sensor is the same technology used in precision agriculture. The cyber defenses developed for NATO are the same defenses that protect our banking system. By plugging into the European innovation engine, we are subsidizing our own high-tech industrial revolution. Furthermore, this creates high-paying, stable jobs. These are not gig economy jobs. These are careers in advanced manufacturing, aerospace engineering, and software development. These are the kinds of jobs that support families and sustain communities. For a generation of Canadians worried that their grandchildren will have a lower standard of living, this agreement offers a path to reversing that decline. To fully grasp the magnitude of the SAFE agreement, we must turn our eyes north, toward a frontier that is rapidly becoming the world's most contested geopolitical chessboard, the Arctic. For decades, Canada has treated its Arctic sovereignty as a rhetorical exercise, drawing lines on maps while lacking the physical capacity to enforce them. We have relied on the implicit guarantee that the United States would protect the North, but the Arctic calculus has changed. The ice is melting, opening up new shipping lanes and resource deposits. Russia has aggressively remilitarized its northern coast, reopening Soviet-era bases and deploying hypersonic missiles capable of striking deep into North America. In this new reality, our interests align far more naturally with Northern Europe, with Norway, Denmark, via Greenland, Sweden, and Finland, than with a United States that often views the Northwest Passage not as Canadian internal waters, but as an international strait open to all. SAFE provides the financial and technical architecture to finally secure our northern flank without relying on Washington. The agreement opens the door for joint procurement of polar-class assets that are uniquely suited to our shared geography. Consider the potential for a joint Canadian-Scandinavian icebreaker fleet built in shipyards from Halifax to Helsinki, sharing a common design to reduce costs and increase interoperability. This is not science fiction. The framework is now in place. SAFE funds prioritize domain awareness, which is diplomatic speak for knowing what is happening in your own backyard. For Canada, This means next-generation satellite constellations, an area where companies like MDA are already world leaders, funded by European capital to monitor the high north. It means deploying autonomous underwater vehicles, drones, to patrol our waters, developed in partnership with German and French naval tech firms. By integrating our Arctic defense with Europe, we dilute the American claim that they must patrol our waters for our own good. We replace a relationship of dependency with a partnership of equals, standing shoulder to shoulder with other Arctic nations who respect our sovereignty because their own security depends on it. Beyond the frozen north, SAFE represents a fundamental reimagining of the Canadian industrial economy. For too long, our economic role in the Western Alliance has been that of a hewer of wood and drawer of water. We dig things out of the ground, critical minerals, rare earth elements, aluminum, and ship them raw to the United States or China, only to buy back the finished batteries, chips, and aircraft at a premium. SAFE disrupts this colonial economic model. Europe is desperate to secure its supply chains for the green transition and defense autonomy. They do not just want our rocks, they want our reliability. The SAFE framework encourages value chain integration. This means that instead of just shipping lithium to Germany, Canadian companies can access EU funding to build the battery processing plants here in Quebec or Ontario. Imagine the synergy. Canadian rare earth elements, essential for the guidance systems of modern missiles and the magnets in electric vehicles, are processed in Canada using our clean hydroelectric power, then integrated into components by Canadian manufacturers before being shipped to final assembly lines in Europe. We move up the value chain. We capture the high-value engineering and manufacturing jobs that used to go elsewhere. This effectively safeguards our resources from American tariffs. If the U.S. threatens to tax our aluminum, we can pivot to supplying the booming European aerospace and defense sector, which is hungry for lightweight, high-strength materials. We transform our natural resources from commodities subject to market fluctuations into strategic assets locked into long-term security contracts. This is how you build an industrial policy that survives the boom and bust cycle of oil prices. This is a huge shift in our industrial strategy. I want to hear from those of you working in these sectors: manufacturing, resources, engineering. Do you see this as a real opportunity on the ground or just high-level talk? Drop your experiences in the comments. Finally, we must address the elephant in the room, the volatile nature of our own domestic politics. A strategic pivot of this magnitude requires more than just the signature of a prime minister. It requires a national consensus that can endure across election cycles. The ghost of the Avro Arrow haunts this agreement, the memory of a world-class Canadian project canceled by a new government, destroying an industry overnight. Mark Carney is acutely aware of this history. The structure of Canada's entry into SAFE is designed to be sticky. By intertwining our banking systems, our supply chains, and our long-term procurement contracts with 27 other nations, Carney is attempting to make the cost of exit prohibitively high for any future conservative government. If Pierre Poilievre or any future leader were to attempt to tear up this deal to appease a Republican president in Washington, they would not just be canceling a government program, they would be actively destroying billions of dollars in contracts already signed by Canadian companies. They would be laying off workers in aerospace factories in Montreal, shipyards in Halifax, and tech hubs in Waterloo. They would be explaining to the Canadian voter why they are rejecting low-interest capital and closing off a market of 450 million people. The political gamble is that the economic logic of SAFE will override the partisan instinct to undo the previous government's work. It forces all Canadian political parties to confront a hard truth. In a world of giants, isolation is poverty. Whether you are a liberal or a conservative, the necessity of a diversified sovereign industrial base is undeniable. SAFE effectively locks Canada into a path of strategic maturity that will be incredibly difficult to reverse, regardless of who sits in the Prime Minister's office. As we draw this analysis to a close, it is worth reflecting on what this says about us as a people. For too long, Canada has suffered from a strategic inferiority complex. We have defined ourselves by who we are not, Americans, rather than who we are. We have accepted a role as the helpful, polite junior partner. This agreement marks the end of that adolescence. It is a statement that Canada is a G7 nation with its own interests, its own capabilities, and its own destiny. We are asserting that we are a distinct pillar of the Western Alliance, a bridge between the dynamism of North America and the stability of Europe. We are seeing the rise of the middle powers. As the superpowers, the US, China, Russia, become increasingly erratic and confrontational, nations like Canada, Japan, Germany, and Australia are finding new ways to cooperate horizontally. We are building a safety net that sits below the level of superpower conflict. The SAFE agreement is the first strand of that net. Friends, the road ahead will not be smooth. The coming months will likely see angry tweets from the White House, difficult negotiations in Brussels, and frantic activity in boardrooms across Montreal and Toronto. There will be setbacks. There will be moments where the cost seems too high. But consider the alternative. The alternative was to remain tethered to a sinking status quo, hoping that the political storms in the US would pass, hoping that our sovereignty would be respected by an administration that views us as a rival rather than an ally. That was a strategy of hope, and hope is not a plan. Mark Carney and his team have given us a plan. It is bold, it is complex, and it is fraught with risk. But it is a plan that treats Canada as a serious nation. We have shocked the world not by shouting, but by signing. We have secured our seat at the table. Now, the hard work begins. We must build the drones, write the code, and forge the steel that justifies the trust Europe has placed in us. We must prove that the Canadian option is not just a backup plan, but a gold standard. If you found this breakdown helpful, please share it with a friend who needs to understand what's at stake for Canada's future. And tell me, are you optimistic about this new direction, or do you think we've bitten off more than we can chew? I read every comment, so let's get the discussion going. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your commitment to understanding the future of this great country.